For 13 days in October 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. The United States panicked as the Soviet Union installed missiles in Cuba. The conflict was avoided by compromise between the countries to remove all nuclear weapons from Cuba. The two countries still have conflicting views today, which date back to the years of mistrust during the Cold War.
For many years, the United States and Russia battled on, refusing to create political ties with each other and critiquing the opposing government's form. And although many parts of their relationship were strained, there were two cases when they found equal ground and came together. The two countries got along during the Russian famine of 1921 to 1922. The famine, spurred on by an unstable government, the confiscation of grain, and the end of the First World War, put 16 million people at risk for starvation. In response, Europe started the Famine Relief Program to aid the Soviet Union. The U.S. had been apprehensive to aid Russia because of their conflicting governmental views, but in the end they relented and compromised with Europe, offering to help the Soviet Union.
The superpowers also joined forces during World War II as allies, when cooperation was essential to the defeat of Nazi Germany. When Nazi Germany fell, the Allies made a jump at the land, wanting to institute their own authority. France, Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union all received equal amount of land. France, Britain, the US combined all their land, but the Soviet Union, not wanting to strike a deal with the other countries, kept its land to itself. This rubbed the U.S. the wrong way, having already had an unstable and barely existing relationship with the Soviet Union.
Fidel Castro, a communist revolutionary, was the Prime Minister of Cuba. He had been associated with the Soviet Union, and he made an alliance with its leader, Nikita Khrushchev. The U.S. embarked on a top-secret plan called Operation Mongoose. The goal was to assassinate Fidel Castro, overthrow the communist regime, and institute a new government that the U.S. could agree with. In the end, the plan didn't work, but this was not the only clash between Cuba and the U.S. The Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro overthrowing the U.S.-backed regime in Havana, and the U.S. pursuing policies to isolate the small country diplomatically and economically are examples of the two countries' disputes. In 1961, the U.S. started deploying Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy that could reach all of Western Russia. However, seeing as the missiles were above ground, immobile, and hard to launch, they were less of a deterrent and more of a provocation, as one senator put it. This setup made the Soviet Union apprehensive, and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, decided that placing missiles in Cuba would level the playing field. In this video, Sergei, Nikita Khrushchev's son, explains his take on the Soviet perspective of the Cuban Missile Crisis 40 years later.
And through this, the Cuba became to the Soviet Union the same as the West Berlin to the United States. Useless small piece of land, very deep inside hostile territory. But if you will not protect the small piece of land, you will lose your face. Your allies would not trust you. So we have to do it. So Khrushchev decided to send missiles there at the diplomatic signal. Don't invade Cuba, we are serious.
October 16, 1962 marks the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President John F. Kennedy and the national defense officials were told about the missiles in Cuba. Distressed, they began considering the two major options presented to them. The first, an airstrike or invasion of Cuba, and the other, a naval quarantine. It was decided that a naval quarantine was the best option, and plans for deploying ships were drawn. The ships surrounding Cuba prohibited any other ships from bringing in more weapons, but did allow necessary resources to be brought in for the island country to survive. A week later, President Kennedy established the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. They met daily during the crisis and handled any new problems brought to the table. President Kennedy also communicated with Nikita Khrushchev, the Premier of Russia, writing, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." The United States Department of Defense announced a military readiness status of 3 on the Defense Readiness Condition, or DEFCON scale. And later that night, Kennedy addressed the public, announcing the evidence of missiles in Cuba. He also explained that the naval quarantine would stay in place until the Soviet Union dismantled the missiles in Cuba and promised not to ship any more supplies to Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
9 days after the Cuban Missile Crisis had begun, Kennedy once again wrote to Nikita Khrushchev, urging him to switch his strategy. By now, some missiles in Cuba were operational, although the blockade prevented any new weapons from entering. The U.S. moved to DEFCON 2, meaning that nuclear war was just one step away. This is the first time the U.S. Department of Defense used DEFCON 2.
Khrushchev responded to the U.S. on October 26, proposing that the Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. would lift the quarantine, promise not to invade Cuba, and leave the Soviets' island ally alone. The next day, the Executive Committee and Khrushchev reached the understanding that the Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba, and in another secret agreement, the U.S. agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. October 28th was the last day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The 13 most dangerous days of the Cold War were over, and Radio Moscow broadcast the important news.
America breathed a collective breath as news of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis reached the public's ear. The British Foreign Secretary gladly accepted the decision to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba and congratulated the diplomatic skills of the leaders for negotiating terms and avoiding nuclear war. Though not all other countries shared the sentiment, China was angered that the Soviet Union had turned its back on Cuba and vowed to support the island country through thick and thin. Negotiations between the U.S. and Russia created new ties and agreements previously not there before. A hotline was introduced, allowing the President of the United States and the Premier of Russia to have direct communications with each other. As a result of the agreements, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed. It prohibited either country from nuclear testing above ground, in outer space, and in the ocean. However, underground testing was allowed. This made for a safer testing technique of nuclear weapons.
The way U.S. acted during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the New World Order of the Cold War, France decided to leave the NATO military structure, meaning France withdrew its military officers and its force from the NATO force structure in 1963. In 1966, it completely withdrew from all NATO military activities.
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, was an agreement signed in 1968 by several of the major nuclear and non-nuclear powers. The powers pledged to contain the spread of nuclear technology. Although the NPT didn't prevent nuclear expansion, the treaty was a major success because it set a model for international cooperation between countries to prevent proliferation. The NPT continues to be proclaimed as an important step in the ongoing efforts to reduce and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Still, like most plans, it had one major shortcoming. Two nuclear powers, France and China, did not sign the agreement.
Khrushchev's reduced authority and Russia's negotiations with the U.S. also affected the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba, eventually affecting the alliance. But it held strong until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the alliance with it. Cuba's trading privileges and aid suffered greatly, but Cuba soon found allies in neighboring Latin countries. After the hotline between the U.S. and Russia was installed, ties that were previously not there formed and stayed, allowing for a more stable relationship to bloom between the two superpowers. And this relationship was helped by the fact that both understood the consequences of yet another near-nuclear war. The military tactic, MAD, otherwise known as mutual assured destruction, is when if a nuclear war were to occur, opposing sides would cause complete annihilation of each other. This is what the US and the Soviet Union knew would happen if a nuclear war were to start between each other, preventing the threat from happening again.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is unique. There was nothing even remotely similar in the preceding years. The panic that had spread through the U.S. public like wildfires was not new, but the fear of nuclear weapons in a nuclear war was. Americans and Russians learned what it was like to live with the threat of nuclear conflict, and to live in an age when leaders had access to weapons whose destructive power they did not fully understand. The compromise that held void of deadly conflict saved the lives of millions of people who could have died at the hands of the nuclear powers governments control.